on their microphone, make themselves comfortable. We're very lucky to have as a moderator for this panel Nancy Cordes. Nancy is the Transportation and Consumer Safety Correspondent for CBS News. And she will, I will just turn this over to her right now and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this very important panel today. As many of you may know, next week marks the one-year anniversary of the Minneapolis bridge collapse, which opened a lot of Americans' eyes to the crumbling state of the nation's infrastructure, its aging bridges and roads, its overburdened and antiquated aviation system, and the shortage of funds to fix the problems that do have a very real impact on commerce in this country. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that $1.6 trillion is needed over the next 5 years just to bring the nation's infrastructure to good condition. Their most recent infrastructure report card gave the nation's aviation system a D. The roads in this country received a D as well, and bridges somehow managed to eke out a C. Our panelists today have developed some very innovative solutions to this pair of entrenched problems, dilapidated infrastructure, and a severe lack of financing to fix it. So I'm very pleased to be introducing them today. The first panelist we'll be hearing from is Jason Bordoff. He is Policy Director of the Hamilton Project, which, as you know, is an economic policy initiative housed here at the Brookings Institution, committed to promoting more broadly shared prosperity. Mr. Bordoff has written on a broad range of economic policy matters, particularly income security and inequality, tax policy, and climate change. He previously served as Special Assistant to Deputy Secretary Stuart E. Eisenstadt at the U.S. Treasury Department and worked as a consultant for McKinsey & Company in New York. The next panelist is David Lewis. He is Senior Vice President with HDR, where he serves as the firm's Chief Economist and Director for Economics and Financial Services. He served previously as President and CEO of HLB Decision Economics, prior to which he was a principal economist of the U.S. Congressional Budget Office. His 1999 book, Policy and Planning as Public Choice, Mass Transit in the U.S., is a quantitative accounting of the benefits of public transportation in relation to mobility, congestion management, and economic development. And then we'll be hearing from Dorothy Robine, who is a principal at the Brattle Group. She has more than 20 years of experience analyzing, implementing, and working to reform government, regulatory, and economic policy. She specializes in rigorous economic analysis of controversial and often complex public policy issues that relate to competition in aviation, telecommunications, and other network industries. And she'll be taking on the FAA today, definitely a complex subject. And then we'll be hearing from our discussant, Ron Blackwell. He is the chief economist at the AFL-CIO. He coordinates the economic agenda of the AFL-CIO and represents the Federation on corporate and economic issues affecting American workers and their unions. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. We're looking forward to questions afterwards, but right now I'll bring up Mr. Bordoff.
I'll get going while this is booting up, I guess. And I should start by saying that this paper was co-authored with Pascal Noël, research analyst of the Hamilton Project, who's standing next to me, coincidentally. I want to actually start by asking for a show of hands. How many of you are more likely to eat a little bit more when you go to an all-you-can-eat buffet than when you order a la carte off a menu? Right. Of course, most of us are. It's not surprising. You've already paid for it, so why not eat a little bit more? And that's true for most things in life. You can imagine that if we prepaid for gasoline in the beginning of the year for as much gas as we needed, people would drive more. That sounds a little crazy, but it's not too far off from how auto insurance is priced today. For the most part, two people of the same risk profile, so the same age, the same driving record, the same geographic location, etc., are going to pay roughly similar premiums. Even if one drives 5,000 miles a year and the other drives 50,000 miles a year, even though the likelihood of being involved in an accident increases the more you drive. And it's true that some firms offer small discounts if you drive below a very low mileage threshold, but even those are based on self-reported, unverified estimates of miles driven, so understandably, insurance firms don't rely on them too much. Now, this all-you-can-drive method of pricing auto insurance has two harmful consequences. First, it induces an inefficiently high level of driving because drivers don't face the full insurance cost of each extra mile that they drive. Since you can't save money on insurance by driving less, people drive a little bit more than they otherwise would, just as you eat a little bit more at an all-you-can-eat buffet than you otherwise would. And all these extra miles driven have significant costs on society: more accidents, more congestion, more oil dependence, more pollution, more carbon emissions. And second, the current method of pricing auto insurance in this lump sum fashion is inequitable because low mileage drivers tend to subsidize insurance costs for high mileage drivers, and we know that low income people drive fewer miles on average. So in response, we propose a fairly simple reform: pay as you drive auto insurance. Rather than paying for auto insurance in a lump sum amount per year, people would pay for auto insurance per mile driven. Your premium might be 5 cents per mile, 10 cents per mile, 15 cents per mile. These prices would still be risk adjusted, so a 25-year-old that lives in an urban area with a sports car and a DUI record is going to pay a higher per mile premium than a middle-aged person with a safe car and a spotless driving record. Now, pricing auto insurance in this way creates an incentive for people to reduce driving because they bear the marginal insurance cost of each extra mile that they drive. And the effect can be substantial. So in the paper, we take what's known about how responsive people are to higher driving costs. And based on that, we estimate that pricing auto insurance per mile driven would reduce vehicle miles traveled nationwide by about 8%. That would mean a 2% reduction in carbon emissions. It would mean a bit more than a 4% reduction in our nation's oil consumption. And to put that in perspective, it would take about a $1 increase in the gas tax to achieve a similar reduction in vehicle miles traveled. And these estimates are roughly consistent with both real-world experience, the limited that there is with this kind of pricing, and also with various empirical estimates that exist. We then estimate the social benefits of an 8% reduction in vehicle miles traveled, again drawing on various studies that try to put costs and show the economic costs of all the things I just mentioned. What's the economic cost of congestion, accidents, oil dependence, carbon emissions, etc. And we estimate the net social benefit of pricing auto insurance per mile driven and getting that 8% reduction would be between $50 and $60 billion per year. Now that may be good for society, but what does it mean for individual drivers? As far as we know, ours is the first study to try to estimate the distributional impact of pay-as-you-drive auto insurance pricing, and we find that it would be quite a progressive reform. Currently, a minority of drivers are responsible for the majority of miles traveled. You can see here that 20% of drivers do 45% of all the driving. As a result, low-mileage drivers subsidize insurance costs for high-mileage drivers, and, here's the important part, most people are low-mileage drivers. And we estimate in the paper that nearly 2/3 of households would save money on auto insurance if we were to do pay-as-you-drive pricing, and the average savings for those households would be about $270 per vehicle. Let me say that again. 2/3 of households would save money, and the average savings per household would be $270 per vehicle. Because low-income people tend to drive fewer miles on average, they benefit the most. If you look at the bars here in this figure, every household income group making less than $52,500 would save money on average. And then if you look at the line rather than the bars, you'll see that their savings make up a far greater share of their incomes, whereas the losses for people with higher incomes are virtually insignificant as a share of their incomes. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean people with high incomes lose on average. Again, even at high incomes, a minority of drivers do most of the driving. And so in every income category, we see that a majority of drivers are better off with pay-as-you-drive pricing. So if pay-as-you-drive is such a good idea, why hasn't it happened yet? The key barrier, we think, is probably monitoring cost. It's difficult and can be expensive to figure out how many miles every car is driving. One way to do that is with a physical inspection of odometers, maybe when you bring your car in for its emissions or safety inspection. Increasingly, technology is going to be able to do this for us with a GPS-type device in cars that records miles traveled and can transmit that data wirelessly to insurance companies. The problem is it's costly to put these devices in cars, and while the social benefits of pay-as-you-drive are quite large, the private benefits to any individual insurance firm we think are likely to be quite small. Second, insurance regulations in various states pose barriers to offering this kind of insurance, and the paper talks a little more detail about what those are. And then there are some other issues that people have raised that may be barriers, although we explain in the paper why we think those probably are not that significant. In response to these barriers, we propose 3 policy reforms. First, states should take the necessary steps to make sure that their insurance regulations permit this kind of pricing, and to the extent they fail to do so, the federal government can create incentives to encourage states to do that. Second, the Department of Transportation, currently through its value pricing pilot program, has a small pot of money to give funds to do things like congestion pricing, pay-as-you-drive pricing, and we propose that be increased a little bit with money for pay-as-you-drive pricing to help give a booster shot to it and develop some real-world learning about how this kind of insurance might be priced. And then third, and most importantly, is to address the market failure that I just talked about surrounding monitoring costs, namely that the social benefits justify the monitoring costs, but the private benefits may not. And so we propose the government help offset some of the costs of putting telematic devices in cars for the first few vehicles to sign up for this kind of pricing. Specifically, we propose a $100 tax credit for each mileage-based policy that an insurance company writes to be phased out once 2% of the nation's vehicle fleet is operating under per-mile pricing. We think that small number should be enough to get the ball rolling because over time, the first few people to sign up for this kind of pricing are likely to be low-mileage drivers. That means those remaining in the traditional auto insurance risk pool are going to see their premiums go up a little bit. A few more people are going to realize that per-mile pricing makes sense for them, and over time, a virtuous cycle can develop where most people, we think, start to switch to per-mile pricing of auto insurance. In conclusion, I would just say I think the time may be ripe for an idea like pay-as-you-drive pricing. At a time of record high gas prices, politicians are proposing myriad policies to try to bring down driving costs for Americans, most of which would do very little in the short term to actually reduce driving costs for people. And to the extent gas prices did come down, we might lose some of the benefits we've seen of people driving less, taking mass transit, buying more fuel-efficient cars. With pay-as-you-drive, you can have both. We can lower the cost of driving for the majority of Americans, 2/3 of households, while also creating an incentive for people to reduce driving, and thus getting the benefit of reduced congestion, reduced carbon emissions, reduced oil consumption, etc. So in that respect, we think pay-as-you-drive is truly a win-win. Thank you very much.
Show of hands, how many people would eat more at the buffet if there was no price attached to it at all? That's what I'm here to talk about. Congestion is indeed a national economic burden. It ranks in terms of its monetary equivalent value with some of our more well-articulated and advertised problems such as diabetes, COPD, and other health problems. It's fundamentally a result of delay, but it is also, and even more fundamentally, a problem of diminished travel time reliability and predictability for not only for automobile users but for truckers as well, which creates both lost productivity, particularly important in a just-in-time economy, and lost time at home with family as we build cushions into our daily lives in order to avoid being late. But those cushions mean less time with family and friends. We incur higher vehicle operating costs, environmental, including greenhouse gas emissions are greater as a result of gridlock, and accident costs rise as well, including lives, more injuries, and property damage. Just to put a few numbers, a few quantitative adjectives into the mix. In 2005, studies indicate that the peak period traveler in the United States spent on average almost 40 hours stuck in traffic because of congestion. The peak period traveler consumed an additional 26 gallons of fuel, and the value of delay and fuel costs amounted to about $700, $710 per peak period traveler in that year. Rolling it all up, and most of us believe that this is sharply understated, but that the economy lost in that 1 year, 2005, in the area of $78 billion due to losses in just fuel and time, and that doesn't count the environmental and safety costs. The number of urban areas where the peak traveler incurs more than 40 hours of delay was one, Los Angeles. In 1982. It was more than 60 in 2005, and by some estimates, another 11 urbanized areas could reach Los Angeles conditions by 2030 if nothing is done to abate current trends. So what is congestion pricing? Well, congestion comes from underpricing. Travelers, all of us, certainly consider our private costs when we take to the roads, the costs that we're going to take in time and the money cost of our fuel and our insurance. And we size up those costs in relation to the benefits of the trip we're planning. But we don't take into account the costs we impose on others and on the economy, what economists call the external costs, which can be anywhere from 25 to 55 or 60%, as much again as in relation to private costs. So congestion prices are tolls that vary by time of day to reflect those external costs, to present us with those costs. So we take those into account when we size up the costs and benefits of whether or not to take the trip at that time of day by that mode and on that route. The result of congestion pricing, according to a consensus of studies, is that they would and do improve roadway efficiency and performance, reduce transportation investment requirements, help direct infrastructure resources to sound transportation investments, including both roads and public transportation investments. And they create the revenues needed to help finance those investments and to help finance the means by which to diminish the inevitable burden that congestion pricing can place on low-income and disadvantaged groups. So, a framework for national reform. We certainly have a lot of momentum building in this country with respect to congestion pricing. The federal government has been a leader in the field with its value pricing program, its urban partnerships program, something called the Interstate Pilot Program, which allows states to apply to impose tolls on existing interstate roads. But there are political and cultural barriers that remain. Anyone who followed the saga of Mr. Bloomberg's plan for congestion pricing in New York knows that political barriers can inevitably get in the way. So what can be done to help overcome those barriers and institutionalize the role of congestion pricing? Well, there are a number of things. I think it's fundamentally a partnership between federal and state and local governments. And I point out just certain elements of those of my proposal here. One is a federal incentive program through either differential federal matching for projects, or if we get away from federal matches in the next round of reauthorization and go closer to infrastructure banking type of approaches, differential loan mechanisms that would reward states and localities that engaged or employed congestion pricing. We need to remove remaining federal restrictions on tolling, including ubiquitous restrictions on tolling existing interstate highways. And states need to remove their restrictions, in some cases, restrictions on any form of tolling at all. As part of that, DOT, and as I'll mention in a few moments, the IRS need to provide some guidelines and some regulatory framing. The incentive formula that would create the incentives I described earlier would need to be created, as would a relationship of the program to statewide planning. Project eligibility attributes would need to be established, a framework for technological interoperability, so you're not stuck with different technologies required to use congestion-priced roads in different parts of the country, and mitigation guidelines. Now, what about the costs and benefits of a congestion pricing program? We know that the economic benefits would exceed the costs. But we also know that poor households are likely to bear a disproportionate financial burden of congestion pricing. The good news is that toll revenues from ubiquitous tolling across all roads, not just new capacity, would provide sufficient revenue to compensate the largest of these losses through means such as monetary compensation, lump sum transfers through the tax system, and through recycling of the infrastructure of the congestion pricing revenues through infrastructure investment, both in roads and in public transit. The line, the upward sloping line, shows the effect of a ubiquitous tolling program nationwide on congested interstates and freeways. It's the increase in expenditure on tolls by income. So as we get wealthier, we travel more, so the line goes up. But the bars show what that looks like as a proportion of income. And that shows that there is a regressivity, that poorer individuals who would spend $400 or $500 a year on tolls if under this program would spend more as a proportion of their income than would higher income households. And that is one of the reasons that I think poses a political and cultural barrier at the state and local level. And part of the proposal that in my paper is to develop, or the federal government would develop for states and localities to implement something I call the Progressive Refundable Mobility Tax Credit. And this is a refundable tax credit modeled on the EITC that would provide a sliding scale of refundable tax lump sum transfers to those for whom tolls have the most egregious effect, and thereby both mitigate social harm, which is an important fundamental thing to do from a policy perspective, and in addition to help create a valve, a political valve, to help states and localities achieve consensus in the application of congestion pricing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the air traffic control system, which is run by the Federal Aviation Administration, which is an agency of the Department of Transportation. The FAA operates the air traffic control system. It also regulates the air traffic control system. The air traffic control system is an underperformer as things that the federal government does is concerned. You experience it in the form of delays. Delays are costly, not by the scale of road pricing, but I estimate that flight delays last year cost passengers and consumers $12 to $14 billion, and that leaves a lot of things uncounted. Another sign, a less visible sign of the underperformance of the air traffic control system is technology. We were talking earlier about the FCC, or the FAA does use a fair amount of very choice spectrum. They use it very inefficiently because all communication between controllers and pilots is over analog voice radio. This is 50-year-old technology. There is no email, no instant messaging, hard to believe, but all communication between pilots and controllers is over voice radio. President Clinton and Vice President Gore used to hold up in events on reinventing the FAA, would hold up a big vacuum tube that was still being used in some of the decades-old FAA technology. The FAA was the single largest purchaser of vacuum tubes up until the mid-1990s, and they had to buy them in Poland and Romania because they were no longer made in the United States. Dave Barry, as he so often does, captured this aspect of the FAA in a column that he wrote several years ago. He said, a recent audit of the FAA showed that, among other problems, air traffic controllers are relying on outdated maps that show giant serpents in the ocean and refer to North America as New Spain. The FAA's so-called nationwide radar system is, in fact, a man named Murray standing on the roof of a Walmart in central Kansas with a walkie-talkie and a pair of binoculars. And the FAA's emergency backup aviation communication system has become increasingly unreliable because, in the words of the audit report, most of the pigeons are dead. That's a bit of an overstatement, but you get the idea. For all of these reasons, the FAA the air traffic control system has been a target of economists and other government reinventors for a long time, for several decades. And the view of the typical economist is that the problems, delays, the old technology, the rising unit costs of providing air traffic services are a predictable result of the way we provide it. That the air traffic control system is in effect a business. It is a monopoly, but it is a 24/7 capital-intensive, high-tech service business, and we are running it out of a command and control regulatory agency, the FAA, which is micromanaged by the Congress and which is subject to all the constraints of the federal budget process. It would be a little bit like if the FCC had run the telephone system at a point where AT&T was a monopoly. It's a little bit, it's the mismatch. There is a fundamental mismatch between the nature of the activity and the agency carrying it out. There's also, and economists have led with the efficiency issue, but they've always said, and by the way, there is this conflict of interest issue because the FAA both regulates and operates the system, and that creates a potential conflict of interest. Normally, we like to have the regulator operating at arm's length. Now, the Clinton administration tried early on to spin off the air traffic control system from the FAA as a government corporation, U.S. Air Traffic Services, Inc., USATS. We had support from the air traffic controllers. It was a proposal worked out at length with debate by Larry Summers, Joe Stiglitz, a lot of people. It was dead on arrival on Capitol Hill. Since then, several dozen countries have done pretty much what we proposed in order to get the advantages of operating their air traffic control system outside of the traditional government bureaucracy, typically as a government corporation. But the politics of trying to do that are simply the hurdles are too great, and one indication of that is that the Bush administration has not even tried to do that. What the Bush administration has tried to do is to change the way the system is financed, which is also problematic. It's financed through excise taxes on passengers, cargo, and fuel, and they bear only a tenuous relationship to the cost of the system. So the Bush administration has proposed to move from excise taxes to cost-based user charges on the actual users, the airlines and the private aircraft operators. And their major argument for doing that was that the revenue coming in from the excise taxes was going down as airlines went to smaller and smaller aircraft, made more and more use of regional jets. You have fewer passengers on board each plane. It costs the system the same to handle a regional jet as it does a 747, but you're getting less from an individual plane. The Bush proposal, very good proposal, was also dead on arrival because of opposition from general aviation, both business and recreational aviation. So the politics on this issue have been deadlocked for quite a while. What do I have to contribute? I make two proposals that I hope can push the debate forward a little bit. The first, and this will disappoint some people in the room, but I don't recommend corporatization of the air traffic control system, moving it out of the government bureaucracy. I propose moving the air traffic system out of the FAA into a separate modal administration in DOT, creating a new modal administration in DOT to run the air traffic operation and to be regulated at arm's length by the FAA. The major thing that accomplishes is to deal with the conflict of interest issue. It may not be the most important issue, but it's a legitimate issue that you've got the operator and the regulator in the same agency. And as we move to a next generation air traffic control system, this becomes more of a problem because you're constantly making trade-offs between capacity and the efficiency of the system. You want that to be done in a transparent way. It's hard to have that sort of transparency when they're both in the same agency. I think creating a separate modal administration would also lend mission clarity to both this new organization and the FAA. And there has been a lot of talk about this recently. Congress is upset because the FAA has been, the FAA regulators have been too cozy with industry. The FAA does these two fundamentally different things. They regulate and they operate, and there is a lot of a real lack of clarity about what the mission actually is, and separating the two organizations would be a step toward providing greater clarity. The second thing, I recommend exactly what the Bush administration proposed, going to cost-based user fees as a way to send market signals. But I think what I try to contribute to the debate here is to highlight the efficiency benefits of that. The debate remarkably over user fees, and it was a very heated debate with the FAA pushing for user fees and the airlines supporting it as a way to shift more cost to business jets, which seriously underpay. So there was an equity dimension, and the FAA was focused on providing enough revenue. Nobody talked about efficiency. The efficiency implications of the current system are profound. It is a lot of what David and Jason talked about. It's sort of the all-you-can-eat bar. The airlines don't pay directly for use of the system, so at the margin they don't face the costs. Big planes contribute more than small planes, which creates an incentive for the use of smaller planes, and that's been a major contributor to delays. The FAA, as the provider of the service, does not get the kind of valuable feedback with excise taxes that a service provider needs and that they get from prices. Going to cost-based prices would do that. So those are my two contributions to the debate. I would say in closing that if you ask the average member of Congress, how do we fix the problem of delays, the problem of the air traffic control system, they would say next gen, the next generation satellite-based system. I would argue investing in next gen is not going to have very much payoff until we fix the more fundamental problems with the governance structure and the financing. And hopefully I've provided a way to move the ball forward. Thank you.
Thanks to all three of our panelists. And now, Ron, we're very eager to hear your first glance thoughts.
Thank you, and I'd like to begin by thanking or congratulating Brookings and the Hamilton Project for convening a meeting on this very important subject at a very critical time, and to Doug and Karen for inviting me to be here and participate and share the views of the AFL-CIO and the American labor movement. And to my colleagues for writing these papers on a wide array of topics, challenging my expertise in each and every one of them, and allowing me to talk to them. Unlike the commenter in the first panel, I'm not nearly as expert in each of your areas as he was. So I wanted to make some opening remarks connecting what I've learned from reading these papers with what I heard in this morning's session, and then draw out some of the themes that weren't apparent or haven't been made apparent today. I don't get a chance every day to associate myself so enthusiastically with the views of Larry Summers on every subject. I wish I did, because I view him as one of the great economists of our generation, or of his generation, and not just in the United States, but in the world. But we've had our differences time to time on issue to issue. But I want to enthusiastically endorse, whether he welcomes it or not, the presentation that he gave about our current economic situation and both the long and short-term implications and role of infrastructure in that. He mentioned, I think, his leadership on getting the first stimulus package in motion, I thought was instrumental. And likewise, I hope that his views this morning will help us move infrastructure and get a second chance at stimulus. He mentioned the double blow in manufacturing. We've lost 3.8 million jobs since it peaked in 1998. We're losing tens of thousands of very good jobs in construction. This has a very disproportionate impact on people with less than a college education, which I'll remind you is most of the people in our country. And he recognizes that this is not a typical recession, that we are going to need a different stimulus in all likelihood, given that this one is based on the deflation of an asset market. And it takes a long time to recover from that. It's not like simply turning the interest rate around and hoping it bounces back. So, and I'd say, I want to remind you that how painful this is for American workers. I don't know what the NBER will decide when this recession started, but as far as American workers are concerned, it started. We've lost jobs every month this year, over 500,000 net overall. I promise you, when the numbers come out next week, it's going to continue, and it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. But it's especially painful for American workers because at the peak of this last recovery from the recession in 2001, median family income was still below what it was in the peak of the last recovery for the first time in American history. And this comes at the end of a generation-long stagnation of wages and rising economic insecurity. It is very painful out there, and it is too difficult for too many people to make a living right now. And it's not surprising to me, the statistic he showed, that Americans, only 20% of Americans, contrasted with 80% of the Chinese, are happy about the direction in which their country is moving. So on the short run, we have an urgent problem. We think we need infrastructure can play a role. If we're going to spend the money anyway for other reasons, why not spend it now and get the increase in employment and the improvement of people's working conditions and shorten and make this recovery more shallow? There's two other economic purposes here. One is we have to find a motor for growth in the United States other than debt-financed consumer spending. We can't continue to borrow 5% of our GDP every year from the poorest countries in the world to finance our excess consumption in the United States. We're not even using this borrowing to invest in our country's future. We can't depend on asset inflation, either in equities in the 1990s or in housing post-2000, to motor this economy. And I think if there's spending attached to the long-term needs that we have to restore our infrastructure, that's a very important role to put it on a more sustainable basis. But the current growth strategy is not sustainable from another point of view, and that is that although we have the world's most competitive companies in the United States, we do not have a nationally competitive economy. That is, we can't borrow continuously 5% of our GDP. Either we find a way to produce more of the value equivalent of what we consume, or we'll be forced one way or another to consume less. Since that's not a very important progress, we have to find a way to make this country competitive. I would suggest that means we have to have a world-class workforce in this country. Education and training is critical for that. We have to have a world-class infrastructure in this country in order to be able to have a hope of maintaining our living standards in an increasingly globalized economy. Running out of money here, and I'm not even connected here. we heard from Governor McCain, very important lesson. You saw he has thought deeply about the kinds of infrastructure his state needs and about the priorities of that infrastructure over time and intermodally. And he's thought about the cost of that and as well as how to finance it. One of the weaknesses of the Hamilton project, in my view, is that these questions have been kind of put aside to focus on two other questions, themselves important. One being, how do we increase the efficiency of the infrastructure we have? And secondly, how do we improve the process for making investment decisions? I would say that I would hope in a further iteration in Hamilton's pursuit of this, you have to have something to say about those key questions at the national level. Bob Rubin asked him the question, okay, you've thought about this estate, what's the national implications of that? That's really not his job, he didn't do it, but the question is, who in the United States is supposed to be doing that? Who is thinking about those questions the way he's thinking about them for the state of Virginia? The answer is nobody. And that's the most compelling reason I believe there is for a national infrastructure strategy. The two questions that the strategy does look at. Also, I would offer the observation. I have no evidence for it, but I believe that if you were to study the efficiency gains from increasing the efficiency of our utilization of infrastructure, and compared that to the efficiency losses and potential gains of having some way to prioritize our infrastructure needs at a national level across modes and across opportunities, you'd find that the absence of our ability to evaluate these options for our infrastructure would swamp the potential gains from the efficiency of the use of infrastructure. The sub-optimizing that goes on, because most of our infrastructure spending is at the state and local level, and nobody's paying attention to what its national implications are, means that despite however efficient our states are, and I was much impressed by what I heard this morning about Virginia, but despite that, for the nation as a whole, we're losing an enormous amount of effectiveness and efficiency in our system. And there, too, I think the Hamilton Project needs some work, because though you recognize we got to allocate these decisions among different areas of our federal responsibility, who's going to do that? How is it going to be done? There was a criticism of the National Investment Bank, maybe appropriate, but at least they're proposing a central place where the infrastructure needs of the country can be surveyed and where different opportunities intermodally can be investigated. But I'm not saying that when we dive into just the efficiency of our use, I'll just make the final point. To its great credit, the strategy paper and each of the papers on this panel were very sensitive to the need to consider both efficiency gains and equity issues. And I noticed that, with regard to two of our papers on aviation and on insurance, efficiency things lined up with equity things. But in the case of programs about congestion pricing, clearly what was, as you recognize, we're going to have to deal with the equity issue alongside dealing with the efficiency issue. This is very important, and not just for these issues, of course, but I would make the following observation from bitter experience, and here I have many scars to show. We see the changes for efficiency in many areas of our public policy, and we get promises of compensation for the people who pay disproportionately for this gains in efficiency, but the compensation rarely comes. So one of the things I noticed in particular about yours, I give you great credit for raising it, you make the option, you give the states the option about whether or how they share the gains, and efficiency gains between compensating people for this and not. Do we really want to leave it that open? Or do we not need to find a way to meld very closely efficiency considerations and equity considerations when they're not integrally integrated? I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So in the time we have left, I've got a lot of questions, and I'm sure you have questions too. And I think I'll just kick it off with a question to Jason regarding your proposal. While it stands to reason that the lowest income Americans do drive less than others. It seems to me that there's a huge swath of Americans who drive long distances precisely because they live far from where they work in order to save money, and now find themselves not just burdened by higher gas prices, but with a program like this, how do you keep it from being punitive on them?
I don't think I have a mic. Should I go up?
There should be one on your chair.
Sorry. Yeah, no, that's a really important question. It's one we talk about in the paper, because the concern that people who have long commutes or live in rural areas are going to be disadvantaged by this policy. And what we show is that, again, we're talking about on average. There are obviously going to be winners and losers, but on average, low-income people do drive less. And we also break out the benefits that I talked about, the 2/3 of households that we predict would save money with pay-as-you-drive pricing. And then we break that out for urban households and also for rural households. And we find the number to be about the same for both urban and rural households. And the reason, again, is because the premiums are risk adjusted. So if you live in an urban region and you're driving less, you're going to pay a higher per mile premium. And if you're in a rural area, you're going to be paying a lower per mile premium. So the question isn't, do you drive a lot? It's, do you drive a lot relative to the people like you in your risk profile? And since geography and where you live is a key factor in your risk profile, the question is, do you drive more than the average person in your rural area? So again, I think the data shows this would be a progressive reform. Low-income people would end up better off, and it wouldn't adversely impact people in rural areas. It would be about the ratio, the share of that gains would be about the same, regardless of where you live.
Got it. David, in regards to congestion pricing, where do you see it being used? Because it seems like it would work well in a city like London or New York, where they have very robust mass transit systems as alternatives to people who don't want to pay the congestion pricing. But in smaller cities where those options aren't as readily available, how would that work?
Well, first of all, I think that a significant majority of the congestion problem does, as a series of Brookings studies indicated that were released in June, the problems are particularly manifest in the top 98 larger metropolitan areas. So it's in those metropolitan areas, those very areas where there is public transportation or potential to build more public transportation options on a platform of existing services, that the problem exists, and we need to focus attention first. But in medium-sized cities, there are some medium-sized cities which do suffer material congestion problems, and yet, as you quite rightly point out, don't present a public transit alternative. It's precisely for that reason that congestion pricing can help reveal what the true market demand for public transportation is. By presenting people with the true cost of congestion in those cities, their demand for transit will become apparent. And there's a chicken and an egg issue, or a timing issue. When do we put the transit in place in those places so as to capture that demand and meet it? But that's an operational issue with fairly straightforward investment staging solutions that are available. So I think that overall, and finally, in the medium-sized cities where the problem is more roads, not more transit, the congestion price can reveal where those additional interchanges and lanes are most needed, and provide the revenues to provide them, that in situations where transit isn't necessarily the appropriate response.
Mm-hmm. Dorothy, when it comes to your proposal, you mentioned the other proposals that were sort of, really big picture proposals that have been killed, and yours is also a big shift. It requires moving an entire chunk of operations out of one agency and putting it into the DOT. Why do you think that would succeed where these other big picture proposals have failed?
It's already in the DOT. It would move from the FAA, which is one agency, into its own modal administration. And I think it would be organizationally fairly straightforward because in 2000, President Clinton issued an executive order for the FAA to, in effect, hive off the air traffic control system within the FAA as a semi-autonomous organization. A lot of effort has gone into that. It's actually, I think, been quite successful. It just doesn't go far enough. So I think it would be reasonably straightforward organizationally to move it. It all should be moved physically. But the key thing is I think politically this could be a winner. I think the opposition to moving this system outside of the traditional government agency as a government corporation, public-private partnership, the opposition comes from members of Congress who want to maintain control. And frankly now air traffic controllers who did support our proposal in the mid-90s but no longer support the concept of a government corporation. I think here you are not taking it out. I'm not proposing to take it outside of government. I would leave it inside of DOT. And I think it's I'm eager to talk to Ron about this, but I think it's conceivable that controllers would see this as beneficial. I think it would benefit controllers. You've got 15,000 very dedicated controllers who are working in a system that is not functioning nearly as well as it could be, and that makes their life harder.
Well, their conflict with the FAA is legendary and long-lasting.
Yes, right.
Do you have any questions, Ron?
Yes, well, the question I didn't get to ask each of them is, these are all meritorious suggestions in very tightly focused areas. And right now, because we have no institution where you could take these things and they could be vetted and made a part of a larger strategy, the only way to move something is either at a regulatory level, perhaps, or finding a congressman from each party in each house to kind of champion something and hope for the best. It seems to me that's very hard going for proposals that are as closely targeted as you are. I just wondered if you had reflections on what kind of institution do we need to bring these kind of proposals to, so that they can get vetted and made part of a larger program to make our infrastructure more effective. I mean, if you have thoughts of that kind.
Anyone want to start?
I'll dive in first. I'm a little bit more optimistic in my starting point. I think that at the federal level, a great deal of planning influence has been generated through planning requirements by Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration and other modal administrations that impose planning requirements and standards and guidelines, certainly for safety, but also for congestion management and other safety management and so on states that would be recipients of federal money. There are strings attached. Mm-hmm. And that's had environmental standards is the one I was struggling to find, coming from both DOT and EPA. And those standards have had enormous unifying, not perfect by any means, but unifying effect on the behaviors of the state and local level. To go further than that and centralize and regulate planning requirements, land use requirements, environmental requirements, my sense is that might be an elegant solution, but I'm not sure, I'm not convinced at all that it would be consistent with the federal nature of the transportation and land use systems that we have in the United States. We're fundamentally 50 solitudes within a corporate framework called the U.S. Constitution. And I think we have to basically live with that and try and forge complex, less elegant, less uniform partnerships. I think a Federal Banking Act could help unify things a little bit more if the modal administrations were to give way to a more centralized system. But I certainly don't think that we should take away the flexibility from states and localities to respond to their individual needs as within a broadly coordinated framework. And I think we've seen the ability of the federal government to coordinate such a framework quite effectively through the various authorization of transportation bills over the years.
I would just very quickly note that for pay-as-you-drive auto insurance, insurance obviously is very heavily regulated at the state level, and most of the movement we've seen toward these kinds of pricing policies have been at states. Texas did something a few years ago. There's a bill pending in the California state legislature and a rulemaking process underway with the Department of Insurance right now to look at pay-as-you-drive pricing, and we've been in touch with a few other states that are interested in this, much more than at the federal level. So that's probably where action would have to happen, though as we talk about in the paper, I think the federal government can offer both carrots and sticks to make that happen.
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
I'm Michael Replogel, Transportation Director for Environmental Defense Fund. The Center for American Progress a couple of months ago issued a report recommending that the next president issue an executive order calling for all major federal decisions to take into account the impact of those decisions on climate change, the impact of climate change on those decisions. A lot of the strategies that you've discussed and recommended in your reports would help move towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Do you think it would be useful to have such a presidential executive order to foster a more quick consideration and action on your recommendations, both at the federal level and by state and local actors who are taking decisions that are implicated in federal transportation policy and decision making?
Who wants to take that one?
I think maybe I'm not sure about the executive order. I think the politics, having the environmental groups on board. And I've heard your wonderful presentation at TRB on the benefits of transportation pricing, and you focused on road pricing, but the same goes for aviation. Flight delays, just to throw out one by my own calculation, the fuel burned during delays in 2000, 18 million tons of billion tons of carbon dioxide, but equivalent to the carbon emissions of 2.5 million automobiles. That's just during delays. Having the environmental community as a voice for changing that is, I think, in the end, probably more important than any executive order. But I think both are good.
I don't know if an executive order is the right way to go. I'm not an expert in the dynamics of leadership to dare render an opinion. But I do think this. I think that there is a political, or rather a cultural, barrier to congestion pricing, particularly on existing roads. There's a sense in America that mobility is a free good. Free roads was initiated in the 30s and 40s and promoted and institutionalized in the 50s. And we now see the idea of congestion pricing culturally as a double tax, where of course it isn't. Having said that, there are those, such as Governor Kane, who's taken steps towards the implementation of some congestion pricing in Northern Virginia and Governor Mayor Bloomberg's initiative. There's been leadership at the local level. But I do think that there's a potential role for a federal leadership push to change the culture of mobility and to change the culture of mobility as a free good or congestion as a free good. So as to give, I hate the expression, so as to give political cover, but more political with a large P, credibility intellectual credibility to the local level to say, look, this is what we're going to do. This is the way forward, and here's why. I don't know that an executive order is the place to initiate that kind of a leadership play, and I don't think that alone would be sufficient. And I certainly don't think that we should nationalize transportation policy or environmental policy. But I do think there's a role for a high level, for the highest or supreme level of government, the federal government, to create a leadership push for to step up to enable state and local elected officials to step up to the plate in relation to cultural change, in relation to mobility as a free commodity.
I wish we had time for a lot more questions, but I think we only have time for about one more, and then the rest of you can tackle our panelists afterwards. Yes, sir.
Jeff Booth, Holland and Knight, chair of the New Starts Working Group, the Community Streetcar Coalition. My question for you is for you, David, and that goes to the issue of really a two-part question. First of all, one of the issues with tolling is in fact inefficient at a level in the sense that it encourages sprawl. And so how do you address the issue of encouraging folks to move further out at a time where that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, vehicle miles traveled, what have you? How do we respond to that? And then secondly, one of the issues with congestion pricing is the fact that you can't use what you don't have if you don't have a robust transit system that gives you a real choice and be able to have a choice every day as to how you get to work. Therefore, you're stuck with paying the toll as opposed to having the alternative and using transit as your alternative. So how do you respond to those two concerns?
Taking them in reverse order. In my paper, I talk about the need for a very determined framework for employing revenues derived from congestion pricing to recycle into investment in public transit facilities. We're talking about revenues from the ubiquitous framework of congestion pricing on all interstates and freeways in the United States with moderate to high congestion, raising at least $100 to $115 billion a year. As I said earlier, that is, if we can take 25% of that and use it to finance a refundable mobility tax credit so as to provide cash lump sum transfers to the poorest of the poor who are hardest hit. That still leaves $80 billion, more than $80 billion, for capital investment that would include public transportation investments. Now, the order in which you do things matters. The transit has to be there so as to enable people to exercise their vote with their feet, if you will. And that I regard as less of a strategic problem as a budgetary timing and scheduling problem. I think we can crack that problem. So I think you're right, the transit has to be there to not just from a fairness and equity point of view, but because I think the demand would be there. It would be a market shift. I think congestion pricing would reveal what the right balance between transit and roadway infrastructure is in this country, using good old-fashioned market mechanisms to help reveal where the demands are, what people want. To your first point, I don't buy that tolls necessarily encourage sprawl. I think that people will seek to reduce the distance between their home and their workplace. To some extent, that will manifest itself in a concentration or densification of land uses. It might not be people all moving into traditional central cities. It might not eliminate the suburban lifestyle, but it might help concentrate jobs and residences in higher density land uses, so that we get people, instead of commuting from suburb to suburb, from Prince George's County to Silver Spring, will choose to live in Prince George's County and work in Prince George's County as well, and Silver Spring and Bethesda and Anacostia and so it goes. So I don't entirely agree that we have that congestion pricing would promote lower density living, if that's what we mean by sprawl.
Well, this has been fascinating. I have to think long and hard about which proposal I want to do a story on first. But thank you to all of our panelists and to you for coming, and of course to Bob Rubin and the Hamilton Project.
Well, first place a hand for our panel. Let me wind up by saying what I said at the beginning, which is welcome. I want to make one comment, though. I thought Ron's comments all these comments were very interesting, but Ron said something that really struck me. As Larry said in the opening comments, we face an exceedingly difficult situation with respect to the short-term outlook for our economy. And for the long term, with all of our strengths, we obviously face enormous challenges, as Ron said, if we're going to have a competitive economy. Somehow or other, we all working together have to find a way to get our political system to have the seriousness of purpose that you all had by coming here today. Because if we don't have a seriousness of purpose economic policy, we're simply not going to move forward. And I think you're right, Ron. I think we are at a critical juncture in our economy, both for the short term and the long term. And that's something all of us can try to further as we go forward. With that, I thank you all for being here. September 23rd will be the next Hamilton Project event, and that will be on a subject called housing, a not low-profile event today. Thank you all very much. So long.
What's that?